Well, welcome everybody to this afternoon's webinar entitled Developing Reflective Practice in Online Instructors. My name is Richard Smith. I'll be your host for this webinar, and I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Margaret Dam, a contributing faculty member with the Riley College of Education, in just a moment, after I go over a few housekeeping issues with you. For instance, let's take a look at what's in the middle of your screen. The middle of your screen, this area here, is where you will be seeing all the slides in the presentation, all the information, written information, in essence the PowerPoint, will be right square in the middle of your screen. On the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see there is a chat room over here, and an area where our captionist is copying down or transcribing everything that is said in today's presentation. In the chat area, you're going to be asked to respond to some questions, and just to get yourself used to using the chat area, why don't you put in where you are right now, where you are attending this webinar from. For instance, I'm attending from Houston, Texas. And you can just type in like Charlene McCord is typing right now. Let us know where you are. If you look at the top menu of your screen, outlined in this yellow color is a little fellow with his hand up, and this enables you to provide a response to questions that are asked by the instructor, in this case Dr. Dam, or you can send a signal to speak louder or softer. You see the hand is raised. When you raise your hand in answer to a question, after you answer that question by raising your hand, when the question is over, remember to click it again so that your raised hand goes back down. In the upper right-hand corner of your screen, you'll see the Help menu. If you need some help or have an issue with Adobe Connect, click here, although I doubt very much that you will have any issue with Adobe Connect today. Okay, Dr. Dam, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Richard, and hello, everyone. I'm Margaret Dam, and I am at the moment in the Atlanta, Georgia area, and I see that we have a representation from all over the country, from California all the way through Massachusetts, so welcome. I want us to engage in some conversation today about the art of developing reflective practice in online instructors. My objectives for this particular session are to actually look at some examples of instructor feedback in order to identify strengths and weaknesses, areas of improvement, and also to identify types of effective feedback based on, as the management literature calls it, maturity level of the instructors, and that really means knowledge or skill level. To put where I'm going in perspective here, I think it's really important that as online instructors, we become reflective about our own practice. And several of you may serve as lead faculty members. And as lead faculty members, what are the kinds of things that we can be doing to help our colleagues grow professionally? And I see reflective practice as one of the best ways for professional growth. So, from your perspective, and you can just jot ideas into the chat box here. It doesn't have to be in full sentence format or anything like that. What comes to mind when you think about strategies that effective online instructors practice. Take just a moment and just brainstorm some things and share using the chat box some strategies that you see effective online instructors engaging in. And I'm seeing some responses coming in, pointing out strengths. That's absolutely right. One of the things we want to do we want to do to our students and for anybody who is giving us feedback is to point out effective practices, point out strengths, to, as Michelle says, to willingly share knowledge and real-world experience. And speedy response to student assignments and to student emails. And I see Michelle indicated building relationships with students, which we know is a very good practice in terms of interacting with students and developing trust in the classroom environment. I see Tanaz, and I hope I said your name correctly, is indicating that not only should the feedback be timely, but it should be individualized and it should be specific. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in just a while, because that is one of the critical characteristics that effective online instructors exhibit. And of course, approachability. So many of the characteristics that you just listed can be found in the literature and in the research. We know that effective online instructional strategies for instructors indicate that they should be responsive to students, they should be available, they should have an online a frequency of presence. And as Walden instructors, we know that Walden indicates we should be in classrooms at least 4 times a week. But it's not just a matter of how often we are there, but what kind of quality of presence do we have? Are we encouraging discussion? Are we asking reflective questions? Are we prompting students to analyze particular situations? In other words, how do we facilitate the discussion, not merely in terms of being there, but in terms of the quality of interaction? We see, as Tanaz pointed out, prompt quality feedback. And there are many ways, I guess, you could define prompt. Walden tells us we should get back to students within, whenever possible, if it's an email or a discussion question, within 24 to 48 hours, and have written assignments back within a week, if at all possible. Other online effective strategies include developing cooperation among students, responding to the diversity that exists in our classroom, as well as to a variety of learning styles. And of course, the whole management of all those things that make our classroom easy to navigate, responding to student questions about resources, about turning in work, and all of those kinds of questions that make the online experience run smoothly. Finally, setting high expectations for students. And the one I'm really concentrating on here is developing self-reflection in learners. Now, as instructors, we work on developing self-reflection in learners. I also want you to think about, how do you develop self-reflection in instructors? If you are a lead faculty member, how do you work with instructors to help develop reflection? And I maintain that developing the practice of self-reflection, because we expect it in our students, we ought to expect it from ourselves. I have three questions I want to ask you here, and I'm going to ask you to respond separately. For the first one, just with a hands up, so put a hands up if you have you received feedback on your performance as an online instructor, either by a colleague, which would be a peer review type process, or a lead faculty member, or a supervisor? So just hands up if yes, if you have received such feedback. And I saw just one, well, I'm seeing two responses there. Excuse me. Okay, I'm going to ask you to put if you had your hand up, to go ahead and put it down now so we can move on to the next question. For those of you who said yes, I think there were two. Was this feedback part of your evaluation? Hands up if yes. So I don't see the results, even from such a small group of us in here, are really not that surprising, because I think as colleagues, we really are not very often put in a position where we get or receive feedback on our performance or on our work. And it's really hard to develop reflective practice without that. So I think, first of all, we need to, there's a need to have such reflective practice. Third question, I'm going to ask you to put this in your chat box. Just type it in. Think about any feedback you've gotten on your work as an online instructor. Whether it came from a supervisor, whether it came from a peer, whether it came from students. Type in the nature of the context that occurred. So you might put in a peer review, you might put in a mentoring situation, you might put in performance evaluation. So what I'm seeing is that you've gotten feedback, Melinda, from course audits, through some new faculty orientation training, and of course when we went through new faculty orientation, there was an opportunity for us to get feedback. And then sometimes never gotten any information. I work a good bit with lead faculty members. Let me ask you to type in the chat box if you have served as a lead faculty member. Just yes or no if you've served as a lead faculty member. So I see Ben has and 3 of you have not. And you may in the future have an opportunity, but every class that I am aware of at Walden, a lead faculty member is assigned to that class. And that lead faculty member visits the class at least a couple of times during the course and completes a survey on what they observed in the course. The survey reflects some of those effective practices that we already discussed. I think there's probably a need to do some more work with lead faculty members, and we've been doing more in the college where I work with regard to going back to faculty members and talking with them about what you observed, what you saw, because really that's how reflective practice is developed, by sharing with faculty members those effective practices that you saw in the classroom, as well as making any suggestions that for how future growth might take place. Again, we mentioned earlier some of those effective practices for online instructors. Those are the things that we should be getting feedback on. I'm going to tie in some of my discussion here to developmental supervision. I had spent my first life in K-12 education, and I spent a lot of it in professional development, particularly observing teachers in classrooms and giving them feedback on their work. And this is based on developmental supervision, which it goes back beyond Glickman, but Glickman is the modern day guru of developmental supervision. He started his work in 1981, and he's still working today. And he conducted most of his work on K-12 teachers, although a lot of his work is very applicable to higher education. And Glickman talks about 3 different kinds of interactions. In other words, if I were to go in one of your classrooms and observe you, when I have a conversation with you afterwards about what I saw, what happened in your classroom, there are really, Glickman says, 3 different ways of approaching it. There is the directive approach. The directive approach basically is saying what you saw. I saw this, I saw that, this is what you did well, here are some areas for improvement. The collaborative approach is more back and forth, talking with the faculty member about why they made certain decisions. Not that that's bad, but a collaborative approach engages both people more in the conversation. And a non-directive approach really has the person you observed doing most of the talking. Now, Glickman says you decide which one of these you use based on, he calls it, and the management literature calls it, the maturity level of the instructor. What that means basically is this. If a person is teaching and they really don't know what they're doing wrong, nor can they adequately explain what they're doing right, the directive approach might be the best. If the person brings to the conversation expertise, but they don't have all the answers, they don't really know why they chose collaborative learning over think, pair, share, for example, but they know that these are good strategies and they can bring some things to the conversation, then a collaborative approach might be best. The non-directive approach is used, and I believe that I look at the directive through non-directive as a continuum. Where you want everybody to be eventually is non-directive. The non-directive conversation occurs when the teacher can explain what decisions they made, why they made them, and how they might improve themselves. In other words, we want to get people to a point where they can start analyzing their own teaching behaviors and saying, I should not have, that they can explain why they chose cooperative learning over think, pair, share, but they can at the end of that lesson say, that may not have been the best choice. If I were to do it again, this is what I would do. Now, to put all that in further perspective, most interaction that occurs between somebody who's observed a teacher, whether it be a supervisor or a peer, and the teacher, tends to be very directive. And the reason that is because directive is the easiest. But for the person for whom you want to develop the ability to analyze their own teaching behaviors, one must move beyond that to other kinds of interactions. This is really a rhetorical question more than anything. Well, we will spend a little bit of time talking about it, but what are some possible challenges to implementing these strategies in an online environment? So think about that just for a moment. We're going to have a whiteboard here and just type in some possible answers. What's challenging about trying to have conversations and develop reflection in online instructors? Think about the challenges that might happen. Yes, I see having the conversations via the telephone versus in person. Of course, that's challenging because we know so much, or we learn so much from looking at people's facial expressions, from looking at how they respond when we ask them the question. So that certainly is a challenge. Oh, so I see some of you are having trouble typing into whiteboard. If you are, just type into chat box. Thank you so much, Melinda, for letting us know about that. And Charlene, you're absolutely right. Meaningful communication. When you are trying to gauge, should I have a collaborative conversation or a non-directive or a directive? It is more challenging in the online environment. But it's not impossible. It's not impossible. It just takes more time and a little more effort.
Just as one interruption, if you're trying to type into the blackboard or whiteboard and you can't, try clicking on the letter T first, and that should enable you to type.
Trying to understand the maturity and readiness level of instructors. That is certainly a challenge. What might be something you could do to determine that? I think it's important to look at the quality of the discussion items that the instructor posts. That is one way of getting a really good gauge on how that instructor is interacting with students. Are they asking high-level questions? Are they giving students the opportunity to analyze a particular situation? Are they challenging, and I don't mean challenging in a negative way, are they challenging some things the students wrote in terms of having them dig deeper into why they wrote that or what their thought process was at the time? I think another way that we can look at what instructors do well and areas of growth is in looking at what kind of responses they give to students. And I have a few scenarios I want us to look at. These are real, true scenarios. And they have to do with the quality of feedback. And we can get rid of the whiteboard right now. They have to do with the quality of the feedback that instructors provide students. So the questions that are on the screen right now are not really are meant to provide you with some direction as you look at the scenarios. I'm going to provide you with some examples of instructor feedback. So these may be feedback that the instructor provided for the discussion assignment for the week. At the end of the week, and this is one-on-one feedback the instructor has sent. And
Doctor, you have a question from Tanaz Artiega in the chat room?
Yes, I'm sorry, I see that. So
it's difficult to keep track of these things. It's all right. Yes,
Tanaz, thank you for asking that question. Really, what we are looking at, the lens through which we're looking at this presentation is how are the instructors doing in terms of their interactions with students, but we can make some assumptions, I think, about how effective this instructor is, or areas that might need to be improved based on their interaction with students. So let's say the scenarios we're going to look at are actually responses that instructors gave students. But I want us to look at it from the lens that I am observing this instructor, and I'm going to have a conversation with this instructor. And in that conversation, I'm going to use some feedback that the instructor gave a student to engage the instructor in conversation about his or her practice. Does that make sense, Tanaz? Yes, and Charlene, thank you. Thank you. So, as I give you these scenarios, we'll do them one at a time. I'm going to maybe ask you to respond in the chat box. So basically what you're looking at is this appropriate feedback? Does it look to you like it's right on target? What might you share with the instructor if you were to talk about that? So let's look at this first scenario. This is actually from feedback to a student on the discussion. And the instructor has given the student, rated the student as a 4 out of 4, which is full points. The feedback that the instructor gave was, I enjoyed reading your comments for our week 1 discussion. You may refer to the discussion grading rubric for an explanation of your grade. Continue the excellent work. I'm noting here that the rubric was not completed. The instructor was just referring the student to a blank rubric so they would know what the different levels 1, 2, 3, and 4 were. So let's look at that feedback based on some of those qualities of effective online instruction that we looked at earlier. What's your reaction to this? Does this meet the characteristic of prompt? Well, we don't know if it was prompt. Is it quality feedback? Is that quality feedback? And I think your response is there, and Ben, I know, is still typing, is right on target. It is positive. There's no question about that. The instructor has given the student a supportive response. However, you're also correct that it is not substantive. In other words, there's nothing in there to give the student feedback on what it is that they did right or wrong. In other words, that comment is so general, it could be, and probably was, given to a number of students in that class. What might you ask this instructor or talk with this instructor about with regard to this particular comment? And I see your responses. Some things you would query this person about should be more personal to the student and her work. What did you enjoy about the student's discussion posts? How will the students know that? And Charlene, I would say that your question there is probably a fairly collaborative one when we looked at the 3 levels. As I mentioned earlier, what's challenging here, if you don't know the instructor very well, you have to probe at first to determine, do they know how they could have done better? Or do they think that this answer is perfectly fine? Because knowing that determines whether or not you're real directive with them, or whether or not you can query them about how they might improve. Needs personalization, Tanaz, you're absolutely right. And of course, I always recommend use the language of the assignment in giving feedback. If the assignment asks you to identify 3 professional associations, who they serve, and what their major topics that they address are, a good way to give feedback is to indicate you appropriately identified 3 professional organizations and so on and so on and so on. In other words, making the feedback specific to the assignment. And of course, we really don't have any way of knowing if the score of 4 out of 4 here was accurate, because we don't have, or was best, or make a determination, because we don't have any way of looking at the student's work. And Michelle, I think you're absolutely right. It does look a little bit canned. Let's move on to scenario number 2. This was an application assignment. And here's the response. And I'll read it. You have a solid start here, Candace, but you do need to work on a few areas. Much of your paper was quoted. I realize things like restating the mission require this, but the assessment piece was quotes as well. I encourage you to try to paraphrase in your own words more to demonstrate your ability to explain the material. Be sure to proof for typos and grammatical errors as well as APA format, and so on. I would have liked to see a more thorough answer about why you felt this program needs an assessment. You explained what that assessment would be in general terms, but not the why piece. And there was a completed rubric with a score of 3 out of 4. How would you rate the nature of this feedback? Does it meet requirements for specificity, what we will call quality feedback, and pointing out to the students certain things that they did well, certain things that might need to be improved? It certainly is. I see, Michelle, thank you. It certainly is specific. It appears to be quality feedback. Now, the next question then becomes, if you were to engage in a conversation with this instructor about this feedback, what might you say or what might you ask? don't worry about using, I mean, you can just put in phrases or words if you want in the chat box, because I know it, you don't need to, it doesn't need to be perfectly in perfect context. While you're typing, I will say, I think sometimes the most difficult quality feedback, and by that I mean feedback that encourages reflective practice, is among instructors who do things very, very well. Instructors who are really, really good and exhibit all kinds of effective practice, it's really easy to give them directive feedback because we can tell them what a great job they did. We can tell them how specific they were. We can basically tell them all the things that they already know about themselves. And I'm not discounting that. I think it is really important to reinforce effective practice. However, even people who are very, very good have room for growth. And that room for growth often comes from having some of those non-directive interactions with those very, very good instructors. And I think that is often the most challenging thing to do. You have somebody who's doing a fabulous job. You let them know they're doing a fabulous job. You point out those things that they are doing very, very well. But in order to get them to the next level, I think it's necessary to engage them in conversations that get to the next level. Let me throw out an example. After you've given the positive feedback, maybe something like, if you were going to do this, if you were going to teach this lesson again, would you do anything differently? That allows them to engage in a thought process about, what might I do differently? Or, let me get back to the cooperative learning. I might say to a teacher who did a great job of a cooperative learning lesson, talk with me about your decision to use cooperative learning. What I'm probing for there is not whether or not they can do cooperative learning. Well, I already saw that. What I'm looking for there is, did that teacher consider different strategies and decided upon cooperative learning because in his or her determination that they had reasons for that being the best choice? Sometimes people just accidentally do things well. We want to develop in them the ability to reflect so that, again, to borrow from the management literature, they're not only competent, but they are consciously competent. Because there are lots of people who are unconsciously competent. They know they do a great job, but they really can't really explain why they do. So we want to develop in our instructors a conscious competence. And Tanaz, I like what you said about putting ourselves in the shoes of the students is always a good idea. All right, so I think we agreed here that this looks like, this particular feedback, again, we don't have the benefit of looking at the student work, but it certainly looks like this instructor provided feedback that was specific as well as supportive. All right, let's look at scenario 3, and this is a discussion board feedback. John, you did a nice job this week. I want you to look at the rubric for the discussion board. The questions that you posed were very good. In your response to Yvette, it would strengthen this had you supported your questions with the course readings or other research. For example, when you asked the question about the outcomes, state 2 or 3 of them. Regarding the economy, ask about current economic times. Does this make sense? And again, I know there are a couple of grammatical issues here, but this is a real life example, so I copied it as it was written. So how would you rate this particular discussion board feedback? Ben, by the way, thank you so much. I just noticed your comment on the university policy on paraphrasing. That certainly would be an example of some good specific feedback for this instructor. So Melinda, you're saying that this might be a good opportunity to have a collaborative conversation with this instructor. And remember, in collaborative conversations, usually both of you have something to offer. There's something that the instructor can contribute to the conversation, and perhaps there's some suggestions that you can give. And this seems to be a possible situation for a collaborative conversation. And you're also saying, I see, that it was a collaborative conversation or feedback between the instructor and the student. Obviously, the "does this make sense" is a rhetorical question. Thank you, Ben. You indicated a 3.5 out of 4. I agree, it's always good to have a rubric, no question about that. However, the instructor did give some areas where it might have been strengthened, where the discussion might have been strengthened. But again, I think a lot of times we don't give rubrics for discussions. Certainly it exists, but always a good idea to give more feedback than less. Tanaz, you brought up a really good point. I think we have to be always cognizant of the fact that we are dealing with adult learners. And I have the privilege of working in the Masters of Adult Learning and the Masters of Higher Education programs. And an understanding of andragogy and how adults learn and what adults' learning needs are is pretty important when you are dealing with grown-ups as opposed to pedagogy when we're dealing with children. And also the use of questions, particularly in the discussion board, to prompt thinking, to prompt discussion, to prompt analysis, are good strategies for effective online instructors. One more scenario, and this again is discussion feedback. The student demonstrates awareness of the community's needs, supports content with course videos or required readings, and may use credible sources in addition to course videos or required readings, provides specific constructive and supportive feedback to colleagues. Score is 4 out of 4. What is your response? What is your feeling with regard to whether or not this feedback meets the characteristics for effective online interaction? Tanaz, I agree that saying the student demonstrates is rather impersonal. It's almost as if you are sharing with a third person what the student did rather than sharing with that person what the student did. And Ben, you're absolutely right. I believe it probably is a clip from a rubric. Let's say you were going to have a conversation, whether it be a written or whether it be a telephone, and you were going to comment on this post, whether it be a question or how might you approach this instructor about this particular comment? I know that's not the easiest question, and it probably requires a little bit more writing, but I think, again, getting back to our notion of what we want, what our goal here should be for this instructor to realize that this may not be the best kind of response. And in an ideal environment, if the instructor is at the skill and knowledge level, maturity level, to analyze their own behaviors, it will be best if we could get the instructor to tell us, or tell us as the person who's engaging in a conversation with him or her, what they might have done differently. Modeling, I think, Ben, is certainly probably the best way that we can help people develop and grow. I think the first step here, if I had not interacted with this student before, with this instructor before, what my first step would be to determine, does this person think that this is the best response? Maybe that person was just in a hurry and didn't take the time to do what they knew would be a better response. Maybe they just don't know that this is not a good response. So my first step would be, I think, to figure out where's this person coming from. Now, also keep in mind that I would have had an opportunity to look at feedback that he gave lots of students in that class. So over perhaps a number of weeks. So some of that can give you some direction for where you might go. But a non-judgmental question is often a good way to approach a situation like this. And maybe even a statement. Like, talk with me about the type of, the characteristics of feedback that you like to give students. Or are there other things you might include? So probing to find out whether or not this person can troubleshoot their work and determine whether or not they could strengthen it or whether or not they can appropriately evaluate it, which I think is even more important. Our time is getting a little bit short, and I do want to give you a chance to ask a question before we wrap up. So certainly if you have questions, or if I can clarify anything in any way, by all means, type those into the chat box. If several of you said you had not had any feedback on your performance, if your departments operate like mine does, somebody is serving as your lead faculty, and somebody is in your classroom a couple of times every course. And perhaps you can explore with your supervisor getting some feedback from that person. One of the things that I do as lead faculty, lead faculty members complete a survey basically on what they saw in the classroom. But I think it's really important for lead faculty members to engage with faculty. Let them know at the beginning of the term, I'm going to be your lead faculty member for this class. That means that I'll be observing you. I will be providing you with feedback, because I think it's real important for people to go back, and I always go back and let people know this is what I saw in your classroom. Here's some really positive things I saw. Sometimes I even ask the people with whom I observe, I see some practices. I see it as a growth from myself to look at other faculty members, and I frequently will ask them if I can use some of their stuff, because I learn from looking in other people's classrooms. I appreciate your very kind comments and your participation in my seminar. What I'd like for you to do as we wrap up, I just want you to think if there was one new learning or observation that you picked up based on our discussion, and if so, just briefly type that in the sharing area. Ben, I think you would be very interested, based on your comment, I think you would be really interested in Carl Glickman's work, Developmental Supervision, and the date I gave you is one of his first works. He has had many works and many revisions on his work since then, and he talks and writes and has researched a great deal on the art of observing teachers and giving them feedback and interacting with them so that this reflective practice is developed, whether in a directive, a collaborative, or a non-directive manner. So I thank all of you for your participation in this seminar, and I have included my email address. By all means, if I can respond to any other questions, I would be more than happy to hear from you. Thank you so much.
And Dr. Dam, I just want to let everybody know that you will be getting a copy of the PowerPoint presentation that you saw this afternoon. Thank you very much for conducting the webinar, Dr. Dam, and thank you everybody for attending.
Thank you for being the host, Richard.
Thank you. Bye now.
Bye.